All right. So hi, and welcome to the IEO seminar series. I'm your host, Hélène Poirson, with the IMS Independent Evaluation Office. And you're all here for the third installment this year of the IEO virtual seminar series. Today, we'll be talking about the state of play in climate science and how to shape policies for a sustainable future. With our first speaker, Dr. Claudia Tebaldi, we are going to learn about the latest findings in climate science and the pivotal role of statistical analysis in projecting climate change impacts. Our second guest speaker, Professor Ottmar Edenhofer, will discuss the economic commitment of climate change, the risks of overshoot, and present some cutting-edge policy proposals to help mitigate these climate impacts on the world economy. And if you're working at the IMF in the audience, this conversation will give you that extra edge to be able to help IMF members to address their challenges of climate change and to better embed climate considerations in IMF operations. If you're part of our external audience, we hope that this opportunity for dialogue and knowledge sharing on climate science and climate policies will also be helpful to your work. And as far as the IEO, we are launching our latest evaluation on climate, so this is definitely a topic directly relevant to the IEO's work. Now, for those of you who haven't been with us before, we usually go for about an hour and 15 minutes on these seminars, and we host them about 6 times a year. And all the seminars are posted as a replay on the IEO website and the IEO's YouTube channel after we're done recording the seminar. On the website and the YouTube channel of the IMS Independent Evaluation Office, you can also find the replays of previous seminars. So if you're not actually speaking, we do ask that you put yourself on mute just so that we don't get background noise. And then when you're speaking, if you decide to ask a question, don't forget to unmute yourself. And finally, please hold your questions until we get to the discussion portion of the seminar, which will be in the last 15 or 20 minutes. And we will first hear from our guest speakers. So without further ado, let's get into the seminar. I'm very excited today. We have 2 world-class experts on climate. Let me introduce our first guest speaker, Claudia, first. Then I'll give you the floor, Claudia, and then I'll introduce our second speaker, Ottmar, who will present, and we'll open the floor to discussion at the end of Ottmar's presentation. So Claudia Tebaldi has been working on climate change science since the early 2000s. She is a statistician by training, and her work has centered around uncertainty characterization and future projections, with a focus on changes at the regional scale, particularly in extremes. She has also worked on observation-based detection and attribution studies in order to characterize the causes of observed climatic changes. In the last decade, Claudia's work has shifted increasingly to connecting the physical changes in the climate system to impact studies and risk assessment. Dr. Tebaldi was a staff scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, and Climate Central, Inc., and she joined the Joint Global Change Research Institute, a division of the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, affiliated to University of Maryland in 2019. Dr. Tebaldi has worked as an author on the last 3 assessments of the IPCC as part of Working Group 1 on the physical science basis. She was an author of the 5th U.S. National Climate Assessment, recently released. She co-chairs Scenario MIP, which organizes the coordinated scenario simulations by the world's climate modeling centers. She maintains an affiliation to Climate Central, a nonprofit, non-advocacy science communication organization dedicated to educating the U.S. public to the impacts of climate change and its solutions. Dr. Tebaldi is an elected fellow of the American Geophysical Union. So Claudia, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll pass the mic over to you. And I think you have some slides that you're going to show.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Hélène. Thank you, everybody. This is an honor, and it's a double honor to share this event with Professor Edenhofer. So yes, I do have a few slides that I'm going to share with you. And if I don't hear anything, I assume you can see them in the right format.
Yes.
So This is a tall order in 20 minutes to cover a lot. So I'll try to give you an overview of both observed and projected changes. For the projected changes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our future scenarios, how we develop these projections according to future scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions. I'll touch on the problem of uncertainty, of course, and I'll have a few words about impact. So I'll start, let's see here if I can move. Yes, I'll start from this figure that maybe is not necessary anymore. I don't think many people out there still doubt the fact that our planet is warming. But it's always a striking figure, so I put it up to point out this is a time series of global temperature, and you see it covers the last 2,000 years with the shaded interval corresponding to the most recent 150, 170 years. And what this figure conveys is not only the unprecedented level of warming, but also the unprecedented pace of warming, which is which both are characteristic of what we are experiencing that pose challenges for adaptation. So if we expand the shaded period, this is a slightly different graphic because it involves not only observations that you see here traced in black, but two other types of lines and envelopes of uncertainty. These are the results of running climate models, and climate models are our way to both understand what has already happened and importantly to project what is going to happen under different assumptions in the way the world will continue or not to emit greenhouse gases. And you see here two types of experiments that were conducted with these climate models that are these very complex computer models. You can think of them as simulator of the whole planet and all the aspects that we see out of our window. So these two types of experiment differ in the type of, we call them forcing, that is the external imposition that we make to the system. We can run this model undisturbed, or we can impose so-called external forcing. And the most important external forcing that changes the trajectory here that you see in the orange line and envelope are the increase in greenhouse gases concentration in our atmosphere. We can run the same models, just imposing the so-called natural forcing, which are changes in the solar cycle, volcanic eruptions, and what you obtain is the green behavior. And the green behavior does not account for the observed warming. So this is how, in very, very simplistic terms, of course, we do so-called detection and attribution. That is, we detect changes and we attribute them to different type of causes. So with the help of climate models and different experiments that allow us to test what happens if we impose one disturbance at a time, we can actually attribute the warming in its totality from pre-industrial averages to the different type of emissions and other disturbances that we as humans have imposed to the system. And this picture tells you that the lion's share, really, of the warming that we experience come from emissions of carbon dioxide and methane, the first two bars, the red bars indicating, a positive contribution to warming. Interestingly, air pollution in the form of sulfur dioxide has had the opposite effect. In fact, it has masked for a long time part of the warming because it has a cooling effect. We are probably starting to see the effect of air quality standards being adopted around the world. We don't have as many sulfur dioxide emissions as in the past, and this may enhance the warming that was previously masked by this type of air pollution. Okay, global temperature is a good indicator, but of course we care about what happens at the regional scales. And I should say all these graphs you can find in the summary for policymaker of the IPCC Working Group 1 report with, of course, very detailed explanations. So this is a stylized representation of what has happened around the world in terms of heat extremes. And the way the IPCC has chosen to represent what happened was by just giving this simple representation of the regions where these heat extremes have been already found to have increased in a significant way, statistically speaking. And that is what you see when the region is red. But also it's important to determine if we can attribute these changes to greenhouse gases. And what you see by the dots here is that for many of these regions with large confidence, that is denoted by the 3 dots, we can attribute these changes to the increase in greenhouse gases. Interestingly, there are a couple of regions where you don't have enough observations to say that changes have been significant, and also 2 regions in the US, of all places, where the evidence is mixed. So the trends are not significant, or different studies produce different trends, and also our modeling that we use for the attribution step is undecisive. So these are heat extremes. In general, everything that has to do with temperature is the easiest part to study and to attribute in this case and to project. But climate models project, simulate the past, current, and the future of many variables. So we can study what happens in observations and through climate models for things like heavy precipitation. And here the picture is a little sparser. So there are regions where the trends are significant, but it's by no means everywhere. Of course, for many regions, you see these in the gray shade. What we find is that we don't have enough observations or a long enough record of observation to decide if there is a significant trend. And for some regions, the ones that are, dashed, we are in a situation, like I said before, where modeling and different studies don't give us a robust answer. You find another picture similar to this that addresses drought events, and it would be, the same level of sparseness and uncertainty. Now, this was about the past and the current state of the system. Of course, we want to know what we should expect for the future, but of course, nobody is, arrogant enough to pretend to be able to forecast exactly what will happen in the future, especially as we extend our horizon to the end of the century. So the way scientists go about doing this is by hypothesizing plausible scenarios, plausible alternative scenarios of economic development, of population growth, but also about things like international cooperation, technology progress. And according to different assumptions that try to span, relevant range of possibilities, we produce scenarios of these, evolution of the human system that carry with them implications about emissions. of course, a world with more people, and that, progresses significantly or less will produce more or less emissions of greenhouse gases. But we also hypothesize mitigation action. So certain scenarios are curbed, as you see here in the left panel that shows you these scenarios over the 21st century of carbon dioxide emissions. And there is a scenario up there called SSP 585 that is an unabated scenario. We keep the hypothesis is that we would keep emitting until almost the end of the century. There is another high scenario with no mitigation or less mitigation. And then there are scenarios with significant amounts of mitigation. And the lowest scenarios that you see in light blue and dark blue are scenarios that are consistent with the Paris Agreement targets of 1.5 and 2 degrees. But you see that the hypothesis here, these scenarios were developed around 2016. The hypothesis was that already by 2020, we would start curbing our emission of carbon dioxide, which hasn't happened. So these scenarios are already implausible by now. We are in the process of developing new ones. So according to the various scenarios, we can run now computer model simulations where these scenarios are, those external forcing that I mentioned earlier, and look at what happens to the climate system in all its multifaceted reality. And let me show you at first, again, global temperature according to the different scenarios. You see here that for the high scenario, these I should say are the results of an ensemble of climate models. We have about 40 climate models that are state-of-the-art in the world that come together to run these standardized experiments to give us hopefully a robust picture of future projections of future changes. According to the highest scenario, the average result here is that global temperature will warm by 5 degrees. And I'm sure you know that we are at about 1.1 right now with respect to pre-industrial. You'll also see, like I mentioned before, that the lowest scenario are meeting the goal of 1.5 and below 2 degrees. You see also some uncertainty bands here that are only drawn for the SSP 2.6 scenario and the SSP 370 scenario, not to clutter the figure too much. But these bands correspond to a one standard deviation across the model. So models carry with them a lot of assumptions and parameterizations, and they create these results that do not agree in absolute numbers, sometimes not even in sign, even if in the case of temperature, there is no model that predicts that we're going to cool. But these uncertainty ranges give you a sense of, the amount of uncertainty in these projections. So just a quick run through a few other metrics at the global scale, and then we will look at some results at the regional scale. So as I said, models produce all sorts of variables, quantities, and you can compute the metric of relevance to your concern. In this case, this picture shows you September Arctic sea ice area. September is the month that climatologically has the least amount of sea ice in the Arctic. And again, depending on the scenario, you see that only the low scenarios maintain some amount of sea ice in September all throughout the century, while all the other scenarios sometime in the second half of the century will see the Arctic being ice-free, at least in September. These are projections of global sea level rise. And you see here again, depending on the scenario that we were talking about, on average, half a meter or maybe up to a meter by the end of the century. You'll also see this dashed line that is a projection that is called, it's a so-called low likelihood, high impact storyline. Projecting sea level rise is very complicated by the behavior of ice sheets that are like the Antarctic ice sheets in particular, with their dynamics that are very difficult to simulate. And some projections see a collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet even within the century, under the highest scenario with sea level rise much higher than 1 meter. Okay, so as I said, climate models are very complex, very computationally demanding, because they simulate things at the regional scale. So they produce, a portrait of our future world that has very fine details for many variables. So here I have a representation of average temperature, and I have abandoned the framework of scenarios for this picture. I'm showing you what regional temperature is going to be like at different levels of global warming, 1.5, 2, and 4. So the idea here is that no matter the scenario, no matter the time, when the system will reach these levels of global warming with respect to pre-industrial, we can characterize the behavior of these quantities at the regional scale. So a couple of points to make here is you may notice that these patterns are not different in terms of the relative warming of the different regions of the world, but mostly they are different in terms of their intensity. And this is a result that has been with us for many generations of climate models. So we know that the high latitudes are going to warm much more than the low latitude. We know that the land is going to warm more than the ocean. And this is true no matter the level of global warming. What changes is the absolute amount of that warming. And we can do the same for precipitation. And I should say these again are model averages computed on the basis of up to 40 models, and maybe using many scenarios that all hit these thresholds at different times. So this is a very stable and smooth picture. There is a lot of uncertainty behind any of these results, but not really in terms of the sign of the change. The uncertainty pertains to the amount of the change. And here is precipitation, average precipitation in terms of percentage with respect to the baseline that is pre-industrial again. And you see changes again that are very similar geographically. So we have confidence. These results are robust. For example, the fact that the Mediterranean or the Amazon or South Africa or the southern tip of Australia are going to dry. The high latitudes are going to wet. This is a very robust result, but by how much it will depend on the level of warming, and also on the uncertainty that pertains to these projections. So attaching numbers to these projections that are true to their uncertainty is still very hard. We can look at things like soil moisture that is relevant for impacts on, for example, agriculture. And again, the same story, the patterns are similar. Well, what changes is their intensity with warming. And we can also look at things like extremes with this lens. And in fact, the synthesis report had this kind of pictures where some metrics of extreme, in this case, the annual hottest day temperature change was shown according to, in this case, 4 levels of warming, 1.5, 2, 3, and 4. And again, the same story is true. The pattern is fairly stable across the warming levels, but you see the changes that can be up to, 8 degrees in some regions when global warming reaches 4. So an important point here is that global warming, of course, is an average, but there are regions that are bound to warm much more than the global average. In fact, most of the land does. Here is a metric pertaining to precipitation extremes, the annual wettest day precipitation change. And now I'd like to address for just a couple of slides the problem of uncertainty that I think I mentioned several times in my presentation. So here is another way to depict, global temperature change according to the different scenarios. In this case, instead of having bands, I actually have the traces pertaining to the different models. And these are smoothed line because, every model would produce a jagged line with ups and downs from year to year. And if, in fact, those ups and downs from year to year are called internal variabilities, the noise of the system that makes, one year cooler or warmer than the other one. And you see here that when we look at the future for a quantity like global temperature, we see a spread, a very significant spread of possible outcomes by the end of the century. And the spread is due to the scenarios that we have been talking about, of course, but also to the models. Different models, even under the same scenario, produce a different global temperature projections. And the right-hand side here, the panel that shows you the 3 different colors tries to apportion, depending on the horizon of your projections, the relative importance of this uncertainty. So the noise of the system is the orange one, is the least relevant, at least in terms of the fractional contribution. But you see that models have, a very large uncertainty responsibility, and scenarios, of course, start gaining importance with the length of your projections. At the very beginning, as you see also in the left-hand graph, the scenarios overlap very much. It's only after several decades where, the choices that we can make in terms of mitigation will start to surface. And things are different for different quantities. So in this picture, I have global precipitation where the lion's share is model uncertainty. Models can be very different in the way they simulate uncertainty. And this is global. Things, change if you look at regional precipitation changes, where now the noise of the system has a large portion of uncertainty, and the scenarios almost disappear because at the regional scale, the variability of the system, intrinsic variability, almost obfuscates the scenario choice for precipitation. Okay, I have a couple of slides. Hélène told me that I could speak for 25 minutes, so I'm taking advantage of that. I have a few slides about impact. And these are, picture that, again, the synthesis report of the IPCC produced to show for different levels of warming, indicated here in bold types under each plot, what happens in terms of days in the year where the heat and humidity become a risk to human health. So again, here, these are averages across models and studies. We would be probably a little lost if we looked at the uncertainty around these numbers, but the average, picture is, something that indicates at least what we call hotspots of for these impacts that, as you can see, do not change across the various levels of warming. And we can also translate, global, climate, physical climate changes into impacts, for example, on agricultural productivity and therefore yields of staple crops that have relevance for food security, fisheries. Again, these are all pictures that you find in the synthesis report with discussion of these results. And here is something that maybe we don't talk enough about, is risk to biodiversity and to species in terms of possible extinctions due to exposure to unfavorable climate conditions. So again, nice and robust patterns, but a lot of uncertainty not shown here around these numbers. And to just, this is my last slide, to just make the point that when the IPCC tries to summarize what are the risks to different, systems like heat-related morbidity and mortality or food insecurity. In this case, it presents results in terms of so-called burning ambers, where you see the change in risk indicated by the color changing gradually and kind of fuzzily across warming levels. You see also here what a difference adaptation can make in lowering the risk for the same level of warming. But again, this is an indication of, the state of the situation where we try to attach numbers to these things. We are still challenged in terms of, having robust quantitative results. So I think that's all I have, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Claudia. We are familiar with some of these charts, but others are new, at least to me. And so I think you've given us a really comprehensive picture, both of the changes coming and their potential impacts, including on the all species, and also the human species. So I think, Ottmar, your presentation is very complimentary, and I think you set the stage in the beginning also with talking about the climate risk. So without further ado, I will pass the mic over to you. But let me first give you a brief introduction. So Ottmar Edenhofer is one of the world's leading experts on the economics of climate change. From 2008 to 2015, he co-chaired the working group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and he was instrumental in shaping the 5th assessment report on climate change, which provided the scientific basis for the Paris Agreement. Since April 2022, Ottmar has chaired the European Advisory Council on Climate Change, newly established by the EU. Its mission is to provide independent scientific advice and produce reports that capture the extent to which EU policies are consistent with the 2021 European Climate Change Act and the EU's commitments under the Paris Agreement. Ottmar Edenhofer, born in 1961, is a professor at the Technical University of Berlin. Furthermore, he is director and chief economist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and founding director of the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. He was amongst the 1% most cited scientists worldwide in the category of interdisciplinary science in 2018, 2020, 2021, and 2022, according to the Web of Science Citation Index. So we are very lucky to have both of you today. Thank you so much, Ottmar and Claudia, for coming. And I will pass the floor to you, Ottmar. And I believe you also have some slides to share with us.
I have a few slides, but now I have a technical problem. Probably I have problems to share it. Probably you could do it for me, Hélène, so that would be the best way. Would that be possible?
But we'll do that.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here and to present my slide. And what I want to do today is I want to talk about the carbon removal technologies and why I think that the CDR technologies producing net negative emissions is absolutely crucial. And this is a very complementary thought and a very complementary argument what Claudia has presented to us. So in the next 20 minutes, next slide, please. What I would like to do is I would like to explain you. So next slide, please. I would like to explain you the climate impacts, and then I will say something on overshoot and how can we incentivize the in general the whole CDR technologies, and then I will end on some governance proposals. Admittedly, it is very much related to Europe, but Europe is one of the largest carbon markets worldwide. And at the European Union, we are now discussing this issue very extensively, and therefore I thought it might be worthwhile to present some of my thoughts on this. And you should not attribute the things which I will say today to the European Scientific Advisory Board. I'm speaking here as an independent scientist. The next slide, please. Next slide. So this is something which confirms what Claudia already highlighted, that we in 2023, we already venturing into an uncharted climate territory. If you look at the Antarctic sea ice extent, on the global sea ice, the North Atlantic Ocean sea first temperature, and so on, and the cumulative area burn, for example, in Canada. So all these numbers point to the same direction, that we are entering into an uncharted climate territory. And this is not a future scenario, this is just to emphasize what happened last year. Next slide, please. Now, it is very important to think about the impacts of climate change. And Claudia highlighted many of these aspects of climate impacts. And the reason why we should be worried that global mean temperature is increasing. So what I would like to report here, a study carried out by colleagues at the Potsdam Institute, which I lead here, and it has been published in Nature a few days ago. And what they did is they tried to estimate the climate damages translated into the GDP losses for the different scenarios, the 1.6 and the 8.5 scenarios. And the result is that the world economy is already committed to an income reduction of 19% until 2050, independent of the emission choices. So these are all the committed damages. I would like also to emphasize the damages outweigh the mitigation costs required to limit the global warming to 2 degrees by a factor of 6. And the largest losses are committed in the regions with lower cumulative historical emissions and lower income. So I don't want to go into the details. It's just to confirm that even if we just look at the GDP, then we see basically already by the mid of the century significant climate damages. And here I have not taken into account other aspects like tipping points, mortality, and so on. The next slide, please. Now, this is the starting point. And what Claudia also mentioned is that probably the 1.5 scenarios are already unrealistic. So, but let me highlight them and explain what I mean when I'm talking about overshoot scenarios. So at the right-hand side, you see two lines. The one is the blue one, which shows that the global mean temperature is stabilized around 1.5. So with the high likelihood, so which is then basically consistent with one of the Paris focal points. So if you look at the left-hand side, what would this imply for a cost-efficient reduction of the emission pathway? You see, basically, we have to stabilize the global emissions very soon. Then we have to reduce the emissions globally annually around 10%. And then we would achieve net zero by 2050. And this is then basically translated into a stabilization of the global mean temperature. But obviously, this is not what is very realistic, given the fact that emissions are rising and rising. Around the globe, we are on the way to use the coal, and I would even say that we are in the middle of an ongoing coal renaissance. So therefore, if we want to have a more realistic scenario, but still to work that the climate targets stay within reach, so we have to accept that there is some overshoot. So here I provide a scenario which we have a modest overshoot around 1.8 degrees Celsius, and then we bend the curve back by the end of the century to the 1.5. You could think about even more overshoot. This is highly contentious, but for the main argument I would like to make, it is sufficient that I rely on this specific scenario. And here, if you look at the left-hand side, so this gives us a little bit more flexibility to stabilize the global emissions. Then we have to reduce the emissions roughly around annually by 6%. At the end of the century, at the mid of the century, we have to achieve the net zero line. But, and this is quite important, we need net negative emissions, because the net negative emissions would allow us to compensate that overshoot. So irrespective of the precise overshoot scenario, I think this is the most realistic way how to think about future climate policy. In that sense, I think that the CDR technologies, the net negative emission technologies, are absolutely essential. Admittedly, some of them are only available at the pilot project, and we will explore this in a few minutes. But this is the most important aspect which I would like to highlight, that the necessity of this net negative emission scenarios. So the next slide, please. So a few days ago at our institute, we have published a paper in Nature Climate Change, which is the first paper which then basically will be followed by a publication of the state of the CDR removal technologies. So what this slide should show is that there are many scenarios to reduce emissions, and just to talk about emission reduction is not sufficient. You can have emission reductions which basically has a strong focus on the demand side, where you have a lot of dietary shifts. You could have scenarios which have a strong focus on renewables, a high electrification pathway, and then also scenarios which rely very much on carbon removal technologies, including carbon capture and storage. And you can see basically in the demand side scenarios, you have a very modest amount of CDR which is required. So if you move then towards the carbon removal scenario, of course, then a lot of removals are required, conventional CDR on land, but also novel CDR technologies. But if you look at the right-hand side, at this panel, this shows that even if you have a scenario which does not rely too much on CDR, where you have a strong focus on efficiency and demand side solutions, even then you need a significant amount of CDR. And these CDR scenarios are basically the only one which are consistent with the CDR proposals which we see in the national energy and climate policy plans. But if you have, if you think that it is not realistic to rely so much on the demand side solution, so the renewable scenarios or the carbon removal scenarios, to see that the required amount of CDR is far above what the current CDR national proposals take into account. And here we see a huge gap in the CDR proposals. So the next slide, please. Next slide. Now, here you see basically the technologies which I have in mind. Some of them are conventional CDR options on land, the usual afforestation, reforestation, soil carbon sequestration, storing carbon in durable harvested wood products. But there are also novel CDR technologies. So ranging from biochar to bioenergy in a combination with carbon capture and storage, ocean fertilization, enhanced rock weathering, and also one of the promising technological pathways, direct air capture in the combination with CCS. I do not claim that these novel CDR options are already up to scaling up. Most of them are available at the pilot project, but nevertheless, I think my argument is here. So this is an important option. This is an important portfolio of technologies, and we should take into account basically due to the fact that this allows us to compensate the overshoot of temperature. The next slide, please. So here you see a few of the potentials, the costs, but also the storage duration. Not all of them have basically the same storage duration. Afforestation, deforestation has decades to centuries where, for example, direct air capture plus carbon capture and storage might store carbon for millennia. And if you have just modified patterns in agriculture, these are year to decades. So the argument which I would like to make here, we have to distinguish two fundamental CDR options. The one are the permanent options, on the other one, the non-permanent. And permanence and non-permanence have serve a different purpose in climate policy, where the permanent CDR option would allow us to even strengthen our climate policy goals around the 1.5 or 2 degree, where basically the non-permanent ones would allow us to buy a little bit more flexibility and to smooth the mitigation costs over time. Next slide. Now, this non-permanent carbon removals basically requires to think about a new way to take into account the social costs of emissions. So you might know that there is a quite conventional metric, the social costs of carbon emissions. This measures the marginal climate damages from carbon emitted into the atmosphere. This is what we are using in our conventional thinking, at least in our economic thinking. But if you take into account the non-permanent options, so then you have to take into account the social costs of carbon removal. This measures the climate change damages resulting from emissions released from storage. If you would have only permanent options, so the both metrics would be the same, but as soon as you take into account also the non-permanent options, which are risky, and I'm not saying we should do this too much, but then we have to think about the social costs of carbon removal. So the next slide, please. The basic idea here is that in the end, we have to think in the following way about, from an economic point of view, about the next step in climate policy. So we are basically have an agreement within the at least within among economists that we have to price emissions. Emissions are caused by burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, but also from land use changes. So we have to price these emissions. But as soon as we think about CDR, what we have to do is we have to reward the carbon removals, because there is otherwise no market case for this. So climate policy in the future has to price the emissions and has to reward the carbon sinks. And when we do this, then basically in an ideal world in which we have just permanent CDR options, so the carbon price, which we will use for the for pricing the emissions, would be exactly the same, which we basically then give the providers and the suppliers of the carbon removal. So this is in an ideal setting. If we take into account the non-permanent, so we have to think about new pricing schemes, because the non-permanent removals should be priced at a lower level compared to the permanent removals. So there are a few options to do this, and I don't want to go into the detail, just to highlight. We could do downstream pricing, upstream pricing, storage stock subsidies, and also pricing the carbon stock in the atmosphere. Due to the time limits, I don't want to go here into the details. If you have a downstream pricing scheme, this would basically mean you price all the removals and all occurring leakage at the same carbon price as you do for emissions in the upstream pricing. So then you have to find a way to reward upfront the removals which are permanent or non-permanent. So this is, all these options have different information requirements, different structure on incentives. So this is something which you can read in the paper. I don't want to go here into details, just to say here we need two aspects of Pigouvian pricing emissions, but also rewarding the carbon, the CDR options according to their characteristics. So the next slide, please. So this is basically what we do in the end is we enter in a new phase of climate policy. We just not only talk about the transformation of the energy system or the land use change system. What we in the end will do is we will manage the whole carbon cycle. The industrial carbon cycle management is, from my point of view, the new paradigm of climate policy. And of course, if we do this, so then we have to think about the governance structure, the incentive schemes, how to do this in an effective way. So the next slide, please. Now, I talked about the pricing schemes, but in the end, so what should we do when we basically have not a pricing scheme? So I give you just a number at the global scale. So the CDR options, which we basically use at a cost between 200 and 300 gigatons per ton CO2, and we would do this by 2050. For this planetary waste sector, we would need between 1 to 3% of world GDP. So roughly speaking, these are not the costs, this is just the numbers. So in Europe, for example, we don't have such a pricing scheme because the finance ministers made very clear that they are not willing to pay subsidies for the CDR options. So therefore, we think in Europe, how can we basically integrate the CDR options into an emission trading scheme? And you see here, this is roughly the same debate we had in the past between prices and quantities. So we can do this with a pricing scheme, but then we are forced, at least in Europe, to think about a quantity scheme. This is just to show you how this could work at the very beginning. So it is very unlikely that we will basically let the emission trading scheme figure out what is the optimal division of labor between abatement and the CDR options. So probably we will find a CDR target. And so if the carbon prices are relatively high and the CDR subsidies are low, because we only start with very low level of CDR targets, so then we might have a surplus. Otherwise, we might have a subsidy. And here you can see politicians might be interested in surpluses. Basically, therefore, they could opt for a carbon price. So this is the starting point. And in the end, the optimal way would be that the carbon price at the CDR and the CDR subsidy is the same. But at the beginning, this is very unlikely. The next slide, please. So what will happen now in the European emission trading scheme is what I call here the ETS endgame. Why is this so important? So you might think, okay, CDR is an option by the mid of the century, and this is something which it's not necessary to care about this now. But in Europe, in the European emission trading scheme, this is not true. So we are in a quite dense situation, because what you see basically in the 30s, we will sell the last permit in the emission trading scheme according to the emissions cap, which the European the EU Commission has already announced. But then we will have, after the 2040s, residual emissions in the system from the cement industry and so on. So we need carbon removals to compensate these residual emissions to get the net zero. But this is something which is quite important, because if the traders and the investors have not a clear understanding that at some stage carbon removals can be used in the ETS, they will bank the permits, and this might lead then to a skyrocket price very soon in the system. And the EU Commission has realized that this is a huge problem here, and because of that problem, So they are starting now to think about a regulatory framework, a governance framework for CDR. And after 2050, we need net negative. And the question is, so are we in a position to think carefully in a way that also emission trading scheme could deliver a net negative saldo in the system? So this is just to show you that we have to work now in the next with the next commission to come up with a reliable governance structure. The next slide, please. So this is just to show you an example. So what could happen? So if BECCS, bioenergy and carbon capture and storage and DAX is excluded, and we have still residual emissions in the system, then you see basically here this at the left-hand side, the skyrocket prices, which could reach a level of 500 and even more euros per ton CO2. So this is too large. If BECCS, which is already available, and DAX would be allowed to be included in the EU ETS system, we could stabilize the price in the emission trading scheme around 300 euros per ton CO2. And here you see basically that's quite important because the markets, this is what we understand increasingly, the markets are really forward-looking, and therefore the Commission has to stabilize the expectations. Next slide, please. So I skipped this slide because of the timing. This just show you that in the end we will start with BECCS, and at the end DAX will take over, given or taken into account some learning by doing experience. Next slide, please. Now, this is just something which I would like to highlight here, and then I can conclude. So how can an emissions trading scheme produce net negative emission? And here we basically start to think about the following proposals which are working on this, and just I want to explain this a little bit. So to implement an optimal overshoot, the regulator could issue a new cleanup certificates. So basically, a company, in an oil company or a gas company, could buy a cleanup certificate. But with this cleanup certificate, it is not only allowed to emit now, but also it pays a commitment to repay the carbon debt later. So the firm purchases a cleanup certificate, and if this firm anticipates the CDR costs are anticipated to decline or abate otherwise, so then the firm will buy such a cleanup certificate. If the firm thinks CDR technologies will never materialize, the costs will be too high, so then for the firms, it might be much more effective to mitigate now. So, and this is quite important, this clean-up certificates could help to reduce the near-term mitigation costs while simultaneously promoting greater long-term ambition, because this reduces the carbon price, and this could allow then the regulator to withdraw the conventional permits if necessary, and if basically mitigation deterrence should be avoided. The next slide, please. So here you see basically this fundamental idea. You have here the net emissions. So then you basically see that you approach the net zero one, and basically then you have net emissions. Then you have here the carbon debt, and here you see the price evolution until the net zero zone. You have a hoteling pathway. Then you see some technological progress, but in the end for the net negative, so the price has to be increased. Of course, all of this requires forward-looking agents. If there is myopic, so then additional governance problems might emerge. So the next slide, please. So this is what we are basically thinking. So such an institution which basically can deal with that, we call this the European Carbon Central Bank. So I know this is a little bit an utopia, but I think this is a governance structure which could help us to manage the carbon, the CDR option in a reasonable way. The next slide, please. So the European Carbon Bank could manage the budget. So basically make sure that the permanent CDR options and the non-permanent can be introduced in the market. It should serve as a lender of the last resort and make sure that liability is guaranteed. So to say that when firms go bankrupt, that basically then additional CDR options are available. Procurement and funding for CDR could be done because the collateral can be used to finance the technological development. Price convergence should be secured in the long run, and of course, international cooperation is also something which could be done with that. So with that, I would like to conclude. Thank you very much for your attention. So and now I am happy to be involved in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ottmar. Very clear presentation. Both presentations, I think, were very, very clear. And there's an agreement, despite all the uncertainty. I think the direction of travel is that the scenario where the baselines we're looking at now are worse than they were even a few years ago. And so the policy ambitions should be commensurately larger, right? So that's what Ottmar's presentation essentially pointed at. So we are going to now open the discussion portion of the seminar, and we'll start with the questions in the chat. I see one from Rafik. Rafik, would you like to come in and ask your question, or do you want me to just read it? Either way works.
You can read it out. Thank you.
Okay, I'll read it. So Rafik is asking, and I think this is a question for Ottmar, compared with a price of, say, $50 for carbon removal per ton, what is the likely increase if CDR costs are added under reasonable assumptions of the share of non-permanent CDR options?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great question. I think so. When we basically think about the conventional land-based CDR options, the non-permanent options, then we have to take into account the non-permanents. And we did this, and when we basically think carefully about the non-permanent, so the land-based CDR options are no longer as cheap as some people might think about this. So that's an important aspect. And what I can say is here, the more the land rents are increasing, the more expensive this CDR options could be. And we have calculated in one of the publications cost multipliers on the private marginal costs for non-permanents, and dependent on the land price. So the multiplier could be 2 or 3-fold. So if we have then basically 50 euros per ton CO2, it could be 150 euros per ton CO2. So that's the first one. If we think about more on the technological options, so the current numbers for DAX is about 400 euros per ton CO2, but some people who are involved in pilot project thinks they can reduce the costs for DAX towards the 200 to 150 euros per ton CO2 level.
Thank you. So I'll read this, the other question in the chat from Marisa. It's also for you, Ottmar. Many of the largest carbon sinks are not in Europe, but in other regions of the world. What are your views on pricing systems for those regions? For instance, could subsidies work? And what about other pricing schemes, such as payments for environmental services, or even better, would taxing deforestation driving commodities at choke points work as an alternative more akin to a carbon tax?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, that's a great question. So I think the most important thing is that we get basically a clear understanding what are high quality removals and whatnot. So certification, from my point of view, is important. And when certification is done properly, So then the EU could basically allow to inject some of this CDR options from outside the world, where basically they are much cheaper and abundant in other world regions. In that sense, I perceive the regulation of the European Union as important, because this is not just something which is domestically an important component, but also sets the standards for other carbon markets, and in particular not only for the compliance market but also for the voluntary markets. But this could be also complemented, what you said, basically payments for environmental services. So this could be taken into account in the pricing schemes, and what you basically highlight here in the chat. But the most important thing, it seems to me, is set the standards, get a clear understanding, then for the European Union define what kind of permits should be then used in the compliance market, and this could also then have a spillover effect onto the voluntary carbon market.
Thank you. So I just want to open it up in case somebody in the room has a question. Just either unmute and turn your camera on and come in, or you can raise your hand up if you will, and I'll call on you. And then meanwhile, while anybody decides if they want to come in, I have a question for you, Claudia. I think you had shown a chart on various scenarios for adaptation, and the impacts of climate were quite different in limited adaptation versus full adaptation. And I don't know if you can tell us maybe a little bit more on what's underlying these scenarios on adaptation, what kind of assumptions or strategies are made.
Yes, unfortunately, that's not my area of expertise, so I cannot go into the details about what is assumed in terms of adaptation. I just know that it's a very, very complex type of analysis, and there are very few results. And what you call adaptation is even, a gray area. So again, just underlining how qualitative this what I was showing is, kind of suggest, how few studies we have and how difficult it is to attach relative numbers. So I'm sorry, I cannot elaborate. Adaptation is not my wheelhouse.
Not at all. No. So Romain has a question. Please come in.
Thanks a lot. Great presentations. Yeah, it's a question for Ottmar, which is about the political economy of carbon removal technologies. Because, the deep reason why we're discussing such disparate options in the first place is because the political economy of climate change has simply been very difficult, right, to overcome. And so my question is, do you think some options are more palatable politically than others? So, for example, one reason why, after all, European policymakers are not so opposed to carbon pricing, we have an EU ETS and it's being expanded, is that they think, right or wrong, that this brings also side benefits, right, beyond climate, like energy security benefits, a push into new technologies, which they think they might be leaders in, And likewise, afforestation, reforestation, people tend to think this brings other environmental benefits beyond climate, right, including, say, preserving biodiversity, the landscape, and such things. And so, my question is, if you have direct removal technologies like direct air capture and storage, this really doesn't seem to deliver any benefits other than a climate benefit, which probably, given the externality, Europeans would never want to pay for. So have you thought about, again, which options among the carbon removal technologies might be more palatable than others, and which ones should be pushed? Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. So let me highlight here a bit, a couple of points. The first of all, I don't think that direct air capture as such has no co-benefits. It has co-benefits because you can use this atmospheric CO2 together with hydrogen for synthetic fuels, for e-fuels. So then you are at least carbon neutral. And the chemical industry needs atmospheric CO2. So they are carbon neutral CO2 for the chemical industry. You can only have biomass or atmospheric CO2. So the supply of biomass is limited. It's not infinite, at least in Europe, but also worldwide. So in that sense, you need atmospheric CO2. And again, all this only makes sense if we are really committed to, let's say, a 2 degree or a 1.5. So in the end, as soon as you think net negative emissions are necessary, then you have to pay the price for this. If you think it is not necessary because we can live with a 3 degree target, so then you can say, okay, then I don't want to have, I don't necessarily need net negative emissions, but I think we need them, and therefore we have to pay the energy penalty. The only choice we have is to bring the energy penalty down, and there are some studies, admittedly at the pilot project, basically assuming that we can reduce this cost significantly, but we cannot bring them to zero, and that this will remain a relatively expensive option. But nevertheless, I think it is worthwhile to invest in these pilot projects. Nobody can predict or assume that they can be scaled up easily, but this is something which you cannot do writing down things on paper. You have to try it. So in that sense, yes, I agree. And DAX, in addition to that, has another benefit, which is basically it can compensate the residual emissions in the hard to abate sectors. And there are many hard to abate sectors, in particular in Europe. So in that sense, I'm moderately confident that in the end, we will move along this CDR direction. And the last thing what I would like to emphasize is in many parts of the world, the CDR options are much cheaper. And I think some of these regions will basically invest in these CDR options. United Emirates is now investing a lot in land-based options already in Africa.
Well, I just wanted to add that, as I said earlier, the two presentations are highly complementary. I mean, it was clear from the first presentation that the 3 degree scenario was just not viable. The impacts on morbidity, health risks, loss of species, etc., of food security were so obvious in those simulations. So that helps make the case. I mean, maybe what I'm also taking away is what you showed us in the first presentation, Claudia, was the average, right? But if you look at, you also made the point that the variability across countries and regions was also bigger, the bigger the increase in temperatures. So maybe one way to overcome the political economy is to actually be transparent about these impacts, because the average may be masking much more striking even deterioration. So, okay, so we'll take another question from the room. Shakil, yeah, please go ahead.
If I may. So one aspect here is, so the social costs of carbon, which I highlighted, and I showed only the reduction in the GDP. But if you translate these new damage functions into an integrated assessment model, so it turns out that the social costs of carbon and the order of magnitude between $1,500 per ton CO2. So this is something which basically shows that CDR is still a worthwhile investment if you take into account this type of damages.
Thank you. Shakil, please go ahead.
Thank you for the presentations, both of them. Quick question, Professor Edenhofer. You mentioned carbon pricing or taxation on the basis of cumulative emissions. Can you share some thoughts on precisely what form that would take?
This might be a misunderstanding. I didn't say under cumulative emissions, so probably I create some confusion here. But no, the carbon. You're right. So the carbon. Yeah, sorry. The carbon pricing. Basically, I think about the carbon pricing based on the flow. So I mentioned one carbon pricing scheme which basically is on the cumulative emission, which basically says you buy a share, let's say, on the atmospheric storage. So this is a proposal which has been put forward by Derek Lemoine, and he basically argues that whenever you basically a company is then basically buys has to pay a price for the cumulative share on the atmosphere. I think this is extremely complicated to be implemented. I just mentioned this for the sake of comprehensiveness, but this is not my proposal here. Because it is complicated, because then you have to trace all the emissions of a company, of an individual institution over time, and this is nothing which I promote here. But it was for the sake of comprehensiveness.
All right. Thank you. I wish we could extend, but we're at the end of our time, so we're going to bring this to a close. I apologize that we didn't get to all the questions, particularly in the chat. And Roma, I see your hand still up. Sorry, we can't get to you. I appreciate everybody coming. I think we talked about a lot of important things today. So thank you for listening and participating in the conversation on climate today, and to our two panelists for your insights. Thank you for sharing them with us today. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much for the invitation.